jump in. Any questions whatsoever? One of the things that Nathan asked me to talk about was the mortgage contingency clause, so we're going to talk about that. But just as far as some techniques and what's going on in the competitive market and what you're seeing is, and I'm assuming some of you know this, but we'll start off with, right up front, let's talk about the deposit money. So what's one of the things when you write an offer, you owe a deposit check to the listing broker in so many days, right? So it says 5 days. Well, another technique there is you can do two things. You can have your buyer write the check when they sign the contract, scan the check to the listing broker, and say, when you send your offer, you'll have that check over in 1 day, because you have it in your hand. So when your offer is accepted, you drive it to the broker's office the next day. Now you have a 1 day turnaround on your earnest money deposit versus the other agent who has 5, right? It gives the buyer, and you've got to tell the other agent, this way, if anything goes wrong, you have my money immediately. Because in 5 days, what if the buyer changes their mind? Seller has nothing to hold on to, right? So as the listing agent getting offers on your listings, you want to make sure that day is short too. So it works both ways. Remember, you're a buyer's agent, a seller's agent, you're still using the contract. The other thing to do, have your buyer wire the money or write the check to us. You're the buyer's agent. It doesn't matter what broker holds the check. You can simply say on line 2C, deposits will be paid to the broker to the seller unless otherwise stated here, and you would say broker for the buyer. Now, this is where you have to educate the listing agent. The state tells brokers what to do with deposit money. It doesn't matter what broker's holding that money. Just because you're the buyer's agent and Keller Williams of Central PA is holding that check doesn't mean that if the deal goes haywire, Nathan can release that money. He can't. There are laws and rules for releasing money. So it doesn't matter if it's the listing or the selling broker. Either one can, has to follow the same rules. So we get stuck in what we've always done, but right now it's a competitive market and you have to think outside of the box. As long as money's in an escrow account, isn't it easier to get it to Nathan than, so then you just say, the money's already there. This is already, and you can put money already deposited in Keller Williams escrow account and Nathan can give you a receipt of that or whatever. Do you have a question?
I do. So do we have wiring capability for escrow?
Yes. Oh,
Of course.
Yes.
Yeah, just request it from
Yeah,
me.
you can wire the money right into the escrow account. So,
Yep.
or you can write the check to Nathan and say it's already, been deposited. So think about that money. That's just, you're still giving, and higher deposits. You really want to give higher deposits. You can't get a deal anymore for $500 or 1,000 or 2,500 like we used to. I'm looking at Bill because he practiced in those days where 2,500 was a decent deposit. Right now, you'd get laughed at, So they're giving 10 and 12. I'm sorry, 10,000, 15,000, sometimes 20,000. Just to catch you up, because you were helping me out, we were talking about deposits and making the days shorter, getting a copy of the buyer's deposit check and scanning it and sending it to the listing agent, showing you have it, so you can put 1 day, I'll get it to you tomorrow.
Yeah.
Or deposit it in our account, even though you're the buyer's agent. It doesn't matter what broker holds that. It can be ours. Your buyer can wire it to Nathan in advance, because you're going to write an offer for them. So you have there's $10,000 in deposit already. So anyway.
Awesome.
Looking at the settlement and possession paragraph, we'll go through this kind of quickly. There's a couple of things I want to talk to you about. Buyers can pay both sides of the transfer tax. It's a way to give the seller more money, take an expense from the seller's side and put it on the buyer's side. And you're giving the seller more money without raising the price and affecting the appraisal. And I know you all know it, but nobody's doing it. And it makes a difference in your offers when the buyer will pay both sides of the transfer tax. It's kind of weird lately. I've noticed it was a quote technique used early on, and now it's fading. Nobody's doing it. And I had 19 offers on a listing yesterday. That's all I did yesterday was process 19 offers. The two that were in the winning did that. So it boils down to those 2 out of 19. So, if your buyer's cash has with cash, pay both sides of the transfer tax, it beats increasing the sale price to put money in the seller's pocket. We're just not doing it. Call the listing agent, ask when the seller wants to sell. What's important to the seller. Don't forget to make that phone call before you write. You know, is there anything we can do in this offer that the seller wants? You know, let's find that out. Let's talk about the mortgage contingency clause. So I'm going to talk to you about something that you're going to say, well, that doesn't make sense maybe. But the history of the mortgage contingency clause was that a buyer always has to continue in good faith to try to get a mortgage. So if you want to make sure if the house doesn't appraise, that your buyer can terminate and get their money back, the only way you can do that is if you do an appraisal contingency addendum. If this is what I'm going to tell you that's foreign to everything I think you know, or you think you know, there is nothing in the mortgage contingency clause. I beg you to show me where in here it says the buyer can terminate. There's nothing. The seller can terminate if they don't get the mortgage commitment on time and the buyer gets their money back. The seller can terminate if they don't like the conditions on the commitment letter and they've given the buyer the time to clear those conditions as it says. But nothing in there says the buyer can use paragraph 8 on a notice of termination and release form to get out of the contract. So you say, well, what happens, Muccio, if the house doesn't appraise and they can't get the mortgage? Look at B3. It clearly states, if this agreement is terminated pursuant to paragraphs 8B, 1 or 2, and that's where the seller can terminate, or the mortgage loan or loans is not obtained for settlement. Turn the page, all deposit monies will be returned. If the house doesn't appraise and those terms that you put in the block can't be met by settlement, you're not going to settlement, then the buyer would get their money back, but not till settlement. It doesn't say the buyer can submit a termination and release form and use paragraph 8. That's the theory and the truth and the fact. However, listing agents don't realize it, buyer's agents don't realize it. You're talking to the listing agent, you say the house didn't appraise, there's no other loan they can get, they can't bring more money to closing, so you call the listing agent, you send over a termination and release, you quote paragraph 8, you put at the bottom of that form that all the money goes to the buyer, the seller signs it, the buyer signs it, and the buyer gets their money back. That's the reality of what happens, but it's wrong. There was no basis for that. But as long as they sign, so you can send over just the release part and say, we want our money back without the termination part, but you can't use the mortgage contingency as the termination reason. So if the house doesn't appraise and you want your buyer to get the money back, you have to fill out an appraisal contingency addendum along with your agreement of sale. That's the only way, because this says if the property doesn't appraise and the buyer and seller can't come to terms, the buyer can terminate and the all monies are returned to the buyer under option 1. You have to pick option 1. So that's how you use the forms together, but there is nothing in here that says the buyer can use, settlement would have to come, no money's delivered, settlement didn't happen, the buyer gets their money back. But it doesn't say buyer can terminate. It was done like that. The history of that was done because there's not a lot of teeth in here for the seller in the agreement of sale. It's more buyer favored. So that pushes the buyer to continue to try to get a mortgage. So maybe they were good doing 25% down, it didn't appraise, and they could still get a loan with just 20% down. They can't terminate because they're still financeable. They can't finance based on what you said it was contingent upon, but that doesn't mean they can't get a mortgage. So the seller doesn't want to give back the money. If settlement comes and goes, then the buyer would be entitled to it. But like I said, you could get a rejection letter from the mortgage company, perhaps share that with the listing agent. No seller wants to drag something out to settlement, right? So you have to think realistically, what are we doing? No seller wants to drag this out until closing anyway. So most sellers would just give them their money back. But when you do the paperwork, just do a release of deposit money. Don't do a termination and release, just a release of deposit money, because using paragraph 8 in the termination isn't justified. There's nothing in this paragraph that says the buyer can terminate. Okay. What problems are you having with the mortgage paragraph, if any?
I'm not having problems with it, except sometimes I'll receive offers that don't have certain information. And, so I think, are my advantage to not have it filled in,
Mhm.
or is it to my disadvantage? Like, for example, I want to know who the lender is. I don't want it to be determined, because they could choose some sucky lender.
If you put TBD in there, it says name of lender. Is there a lender called TBD? No. Because your buyer has to apply to that lender. If there's a name in there and the buyer doesn't apply to that lender, they're in default of the contract and they would lose their deposit in a battle. That has happened and the buyer lost. So if you put in there PSECU or Members First or Fulton Bank or, whatever bank you're using, the buyer must apply to that company. If it's blank, it was blank. They didn't have to apply to anybody specifically, but you submitted your offer with a pre-approval letter from someone. So you are leading the listing agent to believe that they're going with whom you submitted. But if they're going to change their mind, they would have the right to change their mind and go with somebody else if it was blank. So as a buyer's agent, you might want that flexibility. Here again, be professional. Talk to the listing agent. Say, Bill, I'm submitting this with a Members First. You see they're well qualified. They are shopping rates. I guarantee you they'll go with someone local. If they aren't going with Members First and they're going to go with Mid-Penn, I'll let you know, Bill. Great, Gary. Thank you. Talk to people. Get back to professionalism.
That's a negotiable, so it still has to be a change in terms of then.
If it's listed in the contract, you have to have a change in terms. If it's blank and I submitted
Okay.
Members First to you, and I say, they may go to, I'm dialoguing with you and I say, Bill, I'm submitting this, I left it blank. I'm submitting it with Members First, but they're also looking at PSECU because the wife has PSECU, the husband has Members First. They also have a Balco credit union. They want to stick with a credit union. I'm just not sure which local one it will be. So have that dialogue, talk to the other agent, let them know what's going to happen versus surprises later on, right? So that's just very important to talk to the other agent and communicate. And you owe that professionalism to each other.
I would say even if you do put someone in there and you know that your buyer is still shopping around, hey, this
Yes.
is what's.
If you don't want your buyer to have to apply to what you put in there, you have to do a change in terms addendum. And buyers and sellers would have to sign that, because if there's a lender in here and you're not using them and you know your buyer's not going to apply there, that buyer's in default of your agreement. And if something goes wrong, they could lose their deposit. The deposits are big right now, so there's big amounts that could get lost. So keep that in mind, make sure it is filled out correctly. But the loan to value ratio doesn't mean it has to appraise. I mean, if it doesn't appraise, then the loan to value ratio hasn't been met, but that doesn't mean the buyer can't bring more money. So again, the only way to get the deposit money back, if you want to. Now, the problem in a strategic offer with appraisal contingency addendums is, now if somebody else writes an offer and they don't care if it appraises and you have an appraisal contingency, your offer is weaker. But if you want to protect your buyer's money, you can still protect your buyer's money and still put a minimum dollar amount in there. And we'll talk about that form next.
Question. Maybe I'm not connecting the dots on this, but if this, what you're saying around this, as far as the deposit money be returned prior, at settlement, if they can't meet the terms of the mortgage, one of the terms of the mortgage is the appraisal. I'm kind of thinking, what's the point?
Well,
Because they're going to get their money back either way.
right. So if you have the dialogue and say, look, Bill, I know I don't have the right to terminate on this, but it's not going to settlement. So if you want to keep your house off the market for another 6 weeks, we can do that. Or we can just terminate now, give the buyer back their money, you can get back to marketing. So really, in reality, that's what's gonna happen. But in theory, you can't use the mortgage paragraph as the termination cause. You can't put paragraph 8 on the termination and release, because nothing in here says the buyer can terminate.
Right, but I guess, so if I have a client that they put a $10,000 deposit down, the closing is scheduled for arbitrarily the end of this month. They can't get their mortgage. Why would I possibly want to submit this? Because my offer is not going to be potentially as favorable with this attached to it.
Because that guarantees they'll get their deposit back if it doesn't appraise, no questions asked.
Okay, but if it doesn't appraise and we don't go to settlement, at settlement, they would just, this would entitle their money back regardless.
It would, but you have to wait till settlement to get their money back.
Right, so they'd be waiting the 4 weeks to get that money back or whatever. But they,
4 weeks, and if the seller disagrees, now you're into the paragraph that says the broker has to hold it. And unless they get notice of mediation or litigation, it could be 180 days.
okay, all
Unless you
right. So I was
change-
trying to find like what, yeah, okay, so that makes more sense then. If that goes those steps further, that would be the.
That's worst case scenario.
Okay,
But following the contract, this is why it's so important to understand every word in this contract, because it's like insurance. You never know what you have until you need it. Then you realize, oh, I thought I was covered and I'm not, because you go to the policy. This isn't quite as bad as insurance. Real estate doesn't have to be gray at all. It can be very black and white, but the devil's in the detail when you don't understand what you did. Of those 19 offers yesterday, I called 2 agents because they filled out their forms wrong. I said, you realize what you submitted to me, your buyer is willing to pay me $206,000 on a $169,000 house. And I don't think that's what you're saying. They said, no, that's not what I said. I said, yes, it is. You filled out your forms wrong. So if we would have executed this, I would have had a shit show 2 weeks down the road when it doesn't appraise. And who wants that battle? But I don't have time to call 19 agents. Submit your paperwork correctly, because I can't be calling everybody to determine what's your intention of your offer. I just knew those 2 were probably wrong. Go ahead.
Okay, question. I came in a little late. So
Okay.
you're talking about the appraisal contingency,
The
correct?
mortgage contingency in the contract. If you want to guarantee, if it doesn't appraise, that your buyer will get their money back, you have to have an appraisal contingency addendum. This is the only thing that says if the house doesn't appraise, the buyer will get their money back. The contract doesn't say that.
Okay, so I thought, actually, I thought it was you that told me years ago.
The LTV. Well, to make it foolproof, because most of the time, if the LTV isn't met and you get a rejection letter, you could submit that to the listing agent with the release of deposit money, but not a termination, so they may not sign it. The contract says you'd have to wait till closing, the funds weren't provided, then the buyer gets their money back.
Right.
So technically, if you don't have
So it just depends on what you think is gonna happen.
well, I'm thinking your buyer, if they have money in the bank and they didn't have the appraisal contingency, then they would be
They could pay the difference.
expected to pay the difference legally.
They could. That's an option for them.
Yeah.
Or they just say, I don't want to try to get another mortgage. I wanted to only borrow 80%. I don't want to borrow 85%, even though I could come up with the extra money. I could still get this loan. I don't want to.
Right. And I think you used the word legally. They're not, they
There's
don't have to do anything.
Right, but they'd
Keep
have
that
to
in
wait,
mind. He's talking deposit.
but they'd have to wait till settlement to get their deposit
Correct.
money according to the contract. There's
Okay.
nothing in the mortgage contingency clause
Okay.
that says the buyer can use that clause to terminate. It's a theoretical thing, but in reality, conversation, you probably could get your buyer their money back quickly. No seller wants to keep their house off the market, but only do a release of deposit money, not termination and release. Because you can't use the paragraph 8 in the termination at the top. You just get the release of deposit money form. Don't do a termination and release, just a release of deposit. That's what you're after. And if buyer and seller sign that, a broker can give the check back. Okay? So, but we used to think that that LTV was
Right.
enough because the terms of the mortgage weren't met, therefore I can terminate, but there's nothing in here that says the buyer can use it to terminate. They can request their money back at any time, and if the seller will sign it, you're done. So it doesn't matter,
Right,
as long, but if the seller refuses to sign,
right.
you can't say, well, my buyer's using the mortgage contingency to terminate. There's nothing in here that says they can do that in the contract.
So we're back to using that.
If you want to secure your buyer's deposit money, but if you don't, and you're not worried about anything, and you want to make a strong offer, you can go without it. You can also waive the mortgage altogether and still get one. Again, communication, tell the listing agent, we're waiving a mortgage, which means to your seller, it doesn't matter what it appraises for, we're buying the house. But no, are getting a mortgage, know that an appraiser is going to be knocking on the door in 3 weeks to get in. Okay, communication, nothing worse than I waived the mortgage, but they're getting one, you didn't tell them, and then the appraiser calls to schedule a showing. And you get the call from the listing agent, WTF, there's an appraiser calling me, I thought you told me there was no mortgage, right? Communication, professionalism, doing your job.
So slightly unrelated, but so I had a situation where, new agent.
Sure.
Lots of dumb things. So I
No,
wrote
those are
out-
learning experience, not learning experiences.
Well, thank God it was an in-house agent who was like, oh, he's new, he's an idiot. So I wrote about the agreement being, we're good to close in, I think it was like 30 days or something like that. Or it was shorter than that, but,
Right.
because I just worked with this lender, they had gotten something done pretty quick. So I wrote that amount of time, again, stupidly, and then the agent called the lender and was like, hey, are you sure, is this, can we do this? Which I should have called the lender and been like, hey, is this cool that I'm gonna write this down? Do you think that you can get this done in this amount of time?
Was that like the documentation? What were you asking them to do in a certain amount of time?
Commitment? Was it commitment?
Oh, close. I'm sorry.
Close.
Closing date, okay.
So I guess, I talked to some people then who were then talking to me about the mortgage contingency, because I had elected it. And, we wrote everything out. If I had that deposit that was in there, and say that in-house agent had decided, okay, yeah, we're gonna do this. So just, I guess now hearing you, because it seems to, if I'm understanding them correctly, it seems to kind of, go against what they were saying. Well, you always have that, that mortgage contingency in your back pocket where you.
Oh, yeah, everybody thinks you can use it
Just
to
so-
get out, yeah.
Okay, just so I'm not like,
Here's the
so
bottom-
you are saying that
No.
you do it, but
The
it's
bot-
not supposed to.
Show me in paragraph 8 where it's buyer may terminate. It doesn't, it never does. Seller may terminate. Seller may terminate, right there, B2, seller may
B2.
terminate. And then 3, if it's terminated pursuant to when the seller terminates, or the mortgage is not obtained for settlement. So when it says, or the mortgage is not obtained for settlement, who was responsible to get the mortgage obtained by settlement? The buyer.
Buyer.
So the buyer couldn't obtain the mortgage for settlement. Then turn the page, all deposit monies will be returned to the buyer according to paragraph 26, the release, so on and so forth. We all think that that's a protection and it's good. If the buyers lose their job, so you put a mortgage contingency in there, now they can't get a mortgage, period. So if the lender sends you a letter saying the buyers lost their job, or their debt to income ratio just skyrocketed, or their credit score sank below where it needed to be, and you have that rejection letter, and you give that rejection letter to the listing agent could just keep it pending and wait till settlement to give your buyer the money back, but why would you do that? So the reality is different than theory, but don't ignore theory. If you fill out a termination form with paragraph 8 as your reason for termination, you're wrong, and I would kick it back to you. Send me a release, but you're not terminating based on that.
If they're trying to sell fast, it's not in the best interest anyway.
Right. And in this market, it's not as important, right? Because the seller has 10 people who want to buy their house. So no seller is going to force you to wait till settlement. I just want you to understand, there is nothing in that paragraph that says the buyer can use it to terminate. So if you want your buyer's money back fast, use the appraisal contingency addendum. If they're not going to get the loan because of an appraisal. If they're not getting it because their credit score dropped, this doesn't help you. The house appraised, but their credit score dropped because they bought a car. Now their debt to income ratio is too high and their credit score dropped and they no longer qualify. This doesn't help you get that money back any faster. This is only if it doesn't appraise. So this is the, I hate to use the word trump card to the LTV.
We have a question here. Karen?
Yeah, I'm just confused how you're going to settlement if the buyer is no longer qualified.
You're not going to settlement. You'd have to wait until the date of settlement in the contract before you.
Okay, okay. And you're saying it's more technicality. So we, as the buyer, if the buyer was the one who can no longer get a mortgage, they technically can't ask for termination, but by them taking the ball and like putting it in the seller's court by saying to the seller, we're requesting our deposit money back, that's then the seller's, most likely is going to then terminate.
Exactly. You can still,
Okay.
you can still submit a release of deposit money to the seller immediately. And if they sign it, you're done. And the buyer
Okay.
gets the money back and the seller can move on. So there are still remedies. There are still remedies that you can do.
Or based on a conversation with the listing agent, the sellers could elect to terminate and they fill out the termination and release, and then
Yeah.
the buyers sign off on it.
Yeah, it doesn't matter who initiates that form either. The seller may say, get out. We want to get rid of that buyer because we have a better offer, a better backup that we can move forward on, especially in this market.
I'm gonna send a determination to everybody but these dozen people who know, because nobody else will know.
Nobody will know this, right? I guarantee you, no one knows this. Yeah. And that's not a good or a bad thing. We should all know it, but it is what it is.
Right.
So, and being on PAR forums is what brought this to my attention, that we were using it, we had a huge discussion on this when we did the appraisal contingency addendum. So, we all learn new things. This isn't something I necessarily knew years ago either. I have used the mortgage contingency as my termination when my people lost their job. So I filled out a termination and release with paragraph 8 as my termination. And because we all know the situation, we think we're using the forms correctly, but I could have just done it with a release of deposit and sending over the rejection letter from the lender.
When you said you had 2 of your late fee offers, they wrote something in there wrong. Could you go over that again? I didn't.
It had to do with the appraisal contingency addendum. They put the purchase price in there, and if you put the purchase price in there, as long as it appraises for that number, but they escalated to 206.
Okay, gotcha. All right, I missed that part. I was thinking.
Yeah, and higher,
Unbelievable.
and higher, yeah, and higher. I had even higher.
I wrote that. I know.
Yeah. So, yeah. Worst experience in 30 years
What is?
of unprofessionalism and just tricks that I've never seen in my life in contracts. Somebody pulled the tricks in contracts, just crazy stuff in a contract. Somebody went in the house, and this is important because I would have never thought this. It's a vacant property. And an agent called me and said, there's water dripping out of the drip leg on the water heater. So I thought it's vacant, I got to get over there. So it was nonstop showing. It was book solid. So I got calls from agents saying, I need to get in. Well, I have it down to 15-minute intervals with no overlaps. There's only so many. Sorry for your luck. Philadelphia agent chewed me out because she couldn't get in. Are you kidding me? You're in Center City, Philadelphia, and you're showing a house in Mechanicsburg. Let me remind you, I don't have to give you access.
Yeah.
Call your poor planning is not my emergency. Call GHAR and get access. I had to tell 4 agents to call GHAR for access because I'm not putting a combo box on my listings. Not doing it.
Yeah.
Not secure.
I don't either. Yeah.
So they all screamed because they couldn't get access, right? So the Philadelphia agent, I was going to remind her of Code of Ethics, Article 11, which says, practice your area of expertise, right?
Yeah.
Do you think she ever sold a house in Mechanicsburg?
No.
Then someone disconnected the garage door. You know how you can pull on the cord, it disengages it. So the garage door, when I went up to get in, it wouldn't work. The gears are running. I'm like, what the hell? It worked the other day. Turned off the water heater, was going through the house, opening the hot water faucets to drain the lines. No water comes out of the bathroom faucet. Somebody intentionally went under the sink and shut off the water valve. Probably to show another buyer that there's a problem with the house. The garage door doesn't work, there's no water, there's no water in the bathroom. So some buyer was trying to sabotage the house to make it look like problems. Why else would this have to happen? Then somebody told me, well, how do you know because it was vacant? They didn't make sure that they left the garage door unlocked between the house and the garage, disengaged the garage door so they could go in and steal the appliances because you can't get appliances now. And there was a set of brand new appliances in there, 2 washers, 2 dryers. You saw the appliances, they were brand new. So like, I have just totally lost my faith in humanity this weekend. And the stuff I had to do at that house this weekend, I mean, and the water heater was leaking because someone played with the pressure relief valve just enough to make it drip.
And you know why they're doing that? Well, one, I found that people are doing this. Well, I found on our listings, we're like, do not touch a thing, nothing. We have a do not touch the fan, do not touch the HVAC, we understand you're gonna try to, you don't wanna have an inspection to be competitive, and yet we want you not to touch the thing, because that's what they're doing. They're running water, they're running this.
But turning off the source to the water, going under the sink and shutting the supply valves off.
Wow.
That's a good problem.
Right now and now. Like, I can't even think of these things, let alone, like, I didn't even want to believe this could happen. Like, I can't believe that people are that divisive, like, it
Wow.
doesn't.
Desperate, it could be that too.
Yeah. But to think about it. And then, so where are the agents with their people? So my point of saying all this is be careful, stay with your people, but it could have been a planned distraction. You go with the agent downstairs, because it was, finished basement. You be downstairs, I'll be upstairs doing this stuff. I'll give you a signal to come back up, and the agent won't know, he or she won't even know that I did this.
Well, have you met some of the agents?
I was gonna say,
I
I'll
was
assure
gonna
you that
say.
the agents aren't suggesting, like, maybe we should test this out so we can be more competitive with no inspection.
No.
Yeah,
I'm
shut the
just
water
saying.
off to a sink so that it wouldn't work at all. So the next buyer that comes through was like, well, what's wrong? The sink doesn't work. We don't have water, which how stupid is that? We could have the water shut off. So their tricks didn't even work. But anyway, you just have to be careful with what's going on now. There's desperate times. People are taking desperate measures. Be careful. And you can't pin that on anybody. So you just have to keep checking. But don't practice outside of your area of expertise either. By the way, your errors and emissions insurance might not cover you if you do that. That's the problem with Bright. Bright gives us access to houses in Delaware, Maryland, Philadelphia, DC, all the states. Doesn't mean you can practice there.
My son lives in college, so I said, come down, I said, no, I'll refer out, I don't know. anything about that."
Referral is the cheapest way you can do it, right?
Yeah.
So let's talk about this appraisal contingency addendum that everybody gets a little confused on. If your buyer will pay the purchase price regardless of what it appraises for, or as long as I'll give you, Mr. Seller, $200,000, as long as the house appraises for 190, then you put 190 in there. If you leave it blank, you're saying the house has to appraise for whatever the purchase price is, whether it's being escalated or whatever. So you have to look at this in conjunction with your escalation clause. If you wrote an offer on a $200,000 house and you put 200 in the contract, but you'll escalate to 225, and you'll pay 225 as long as the house appraises for 215, then you put 215 in here. If you leave it blank, it has to appraise at the purchase price. So if it escalated to 225, now you're telling the seller, I'll give you 225, but it has to appraise at 225. So I'll give you 500 if it appraises at 500. So you're just, buyer's agents are leading sellers to believe that here's a big high number, but I'm not giving you that number. It has to appraise.
Mhm.
So that's another trick that I call it a trick, not a technique, because it's deceitful. But a bad listing agent who doesn't understand that will tell their seller, we can get 225, but if this is attached, yeah, it has to appraise.
See, I don't see this dishonest, because if I have a buyer who's willing to give that amount, if it appraises, they don't have cash to do it otherwise. I don't
Right, but
see
I'm
it
just
dishonest.
saying, if it's not that it's dishonest, you're right, Bill, that's probably a bad choice of words, and I apologize. But you should have, as a buyer's agent, you should be doing a market analysis of what a home is worth. Just as a seller's agent does it to determine the list price, a buyer's agent should be doing it if you wrote an offer for a buyer and didn't give them a CMA, you're missing a piece of the paperwork, because it's your job to give them a CMA of what the house is worth to determine what they should offer, right? Unless they tell you, I don't care what it's worth, I'll offer this. You know, so you should know that the house is never gonna appraise at 225 or 250 or whatever you offered. But if they're willing to pay that, if it only appraises at 200, that was the purpose of this, because agents were writing language. This was only created in the midst of chaos because we were practicing law and agents were getting in trouble. So the form is designed to say, we'll pay the purchase price if it appraises at a minimum value. Now, everybody says, I don't know what to put in there because I don't know what I'm going to escalate to. So I put an escalation clause in up to 210. But if 205 was the highest and I said I'd go over by 1,000 above the highest up to 210, now you got it for 206, right? You didn't have to pay 210. So you could talk to the other agent, or you could say in here, as long as it appraises for $5,000 below what the final escalated price is, you know, you could do something, and then you could redo this, you know.
What about a scenario where you have an you know, with the original offer, and I'm just gonna use round numbers for math in my head, but let's say it's a 200, you know, you're offering $200,000
Sure.
on a $200,000 listing, you're writing it up, and the buyer says, I'm willing to pay $5,000 for, you know, to split the difference in an appraisal cut. So in that scenario, that you would write on here, as long as the home appraises for 195, they'll pay 2.
Mhm.
Right? But you have an escalation clause up to 215. Obviously, they're not going to pay 215 if the appraise is at 195. So do you have 2 appraisal contingency addendums, one that goes with the escalation clause because there's a box to check, appraisal contingency addendum attached. And so you've got this offer complete with an appraisal contingency addendum, and then if the escalation clause is engaged by another offer, then
You
this
could do it
appraisal
that way. Again, communication with the other agent as to what you're trying to do. I got all 19 offers. You know how many phone calls I got from agents? 4. Tons of texts. How many do you have? How many do you think I have? Did you look on showing time and see that it's booked solid, which I get. But everybody want to
Well,
know, what do you
also,
have in hand? I don't have
We always
any.
say,
in-
what does it matter?
Right. I don't have any in hand because when you set a deadline, they come in like, you know,
5 minutes.
yeah. Of those 19, 14 came in yesterday from noon until 3.
Mhm.
So, you know, I had 4 in advance. So how many do I have in hand? 4. What am I expecting? Probably 20. And I told people probably about 20 and it was 19. So doesn't really matter. You're right. Another thing I'm going to start doing, I'm putting right in my listing, my 8 remarks to agents. You know, if you do not have Supra, call GHAR. I'm not accommodating you to get in the house. So if you don't have Supra, call GHAR. Only send me offers in PDF format because I got a ton of dot loops and I couldn't download them and they were a mess. Don't dot loop me. I'm not on dot loop. Don't assume I'm on dot loop. Send me a PDF, right? So I've really learned to put some notes in there. Nobody reads them. Nobody reads them. Agents ask me to send them a disclosure. It's on Bright. I don't have access to Bright. Not my problem. So if you don't have access to Bright, you know, I told several agents, you're with national chains, call a local Acme, I won't give the company name, call a local Acme real estate agent, see if they'll get you in, because you're Acme from Gaithersburg, Maryland, not my problem. You can't get into my lockbox system, or you don't subscribe to Bright, sell it on realtor.com.
Can somebody from outside of our area get some kind of a code for a super?
$400, they have to subscribe.
So they call GHAR and then they're told $400 to subscribe.
Well, and for Century, because how often are any
You
of us
can get
in
like a
New York?
day
I mean,
pass.
you can get a day.
That's
pass,
the
or you
problem.
can get
Some
like a
lockbox
10-day or
systems give a
30.
day pass and they want a day code for ours, and we
Yeah.
don't do it.
Mhm.
I will tell you, and I don't think it's confidential information, we are as a board looking into lockbox, you know, lockbox solutions, and, you know, like now we can partner with Reading. You know, our lockboxes will work in Reading, I think in Lebanon and stuff like that. So I think, and I don't know exactly where, but I think it's Reading we're working with. They're going to their we'll be able to go with some other areas. And when that's finalized, we'll announce that to everybody. So we are trying to expand, but yeah, if you're scheduling a showing, don't you need to know how to get in?
Well, and we get calls all the time. I'm coming from Maryland.
Yeah.
Can somebody let me in? And, I'm with Acme. We call somebody at the local Acme here. We can give you the number to that office, but call somebody there. Get
Yeah.
one of your agents to help you
Yes.
out. Like, I don't open doors for a living.
Right. So when you're using this, there's two options. Option one gives the buyer the right to terminate. If you use option two and the appraisal isn't met, you got to go back to the agreement of sale, which says you'd have to wait till settlement. So just remember that option two at the very last, option two B. So option two, number 3, if the terms of number 1, that it didn't appraise, then you'd have to go to the terms of the mortgage contingency would prevail. So if you really want it to be secure, option 1, option 2 is, as long as it's satisfied, they'll definitely move forward. There's not a release of money, and 2, you go back to the agreement of sale. So just be careful about that. Did she have that other form?
I just gave it out, yeah. I printed it off.
Okay.
Do you want one?
The one thing I want to tell you all is, this one. The form that nobody's using and we should start using, I think. I wish it was our policy to use it, but y'all understand the buyer's agency agreement. So if you're giving a buyer's agent, if you're sitting with the buyer and explaining this buyer's agency agreement, so we're going to talk about the buyer appointment for like 5 minutes.
149.
Okay. So you're on your initial buyer's agency appointment. You hope that they'll sign up with you. You need to have a buyer's agency contract signed. If you're explaining this and saying, you can use my services, it's not going to cost you any money, the seller pays me, you're giving the wrong dialogue. That is not true. They are hiring you and they are paying you. They won't pay you as long as they buy a house where the seller is willing to compensate the buyer's agent. But if you read this 2B, broker's fee on the buyer's agency contract, it clearly states broker's fee paid by buyer to broker is as follows. And that's where you put your percentages, and that's where you put in broker fee. Then it goes on to say, it is our policy to accept compensation offered by the listing broker. And when they're represented by a listed real estate broker, that's an expense they won't have. But what happens if they buy a FSBO? Somebody has to be paid. You want your buyers to stop looking at FSBOs and stop calling FSBOs? Let them know you gotta pay me if you buy that FSBO, whether I'm involved or not. They'll never look at another FSBO if you explain this right. Attached to this, if you look at the special clauses, is a single agency addendum form. This is very important. It's showing your buyer you're committed to them and that you're never going to be both their buyer's agent and the listing agent. So when a buyer hires you, what do you think they're asking you to do? Work for them, right? Help them negotiate, right? This shows them you're committed to what you're saying. You're putting your money where your mouth is. You check block number 2, that the broker only represents buyers and sellers in the same transaction when separate designated agents are representing each party. In the event that the buyer, and I tell my buyers this, so in the event that you choose to buy my listing, I release you from the buyer's agency contract as it relates to that one property. So you can't buy my listings once you sign up with me. You think, well, why can't they? Because you can't be a dual agent. You can legally, but why did your buyer hire you?
To represent that.
To represent them. Why did your seller hire you?
To represent that.
To get them what?
Less money.
Right. So we're going to get into that next. Hold off on that. This single agency addendum form. So what are your employment agreements with your parties? When you're employed by a buyer, what's your employment agreement with the buyer? Buyer's agency contract. What's your employment agreement with the seller? Listing contract. Both of those employment contracts have the single agency addendum listed to attach it. So I never have a buyer's agency agreement in my file or a listing contract without a single agency addendum. Now you say, well, I'm greedy. I want all the money. right? You can get all the money. You can be as greedy as you want to be. You can sell your own listings, but to an unrepresented buyer. So as a buyer's agent, I tell my buyer, now, if I have a buyer, Kim's my buyer, and Kim wants a cute little Cape Cod for $150,000. And I'm going on a listing of a cute little Cape Cod for $150,000. I can say to the seller, you hired me, you trusted me. I'm not going to list your house. Let me bring a buyer first. I'll save you some money on commission. And maybe I am going to conduct the entire transaction as a buyer's agent only with an unrepresented seller. Okay, so we have a form for that. It's called broker fee agreement that the seller will agree to pay. Maybe my buyer's willing to pay me and the seller doesn't pay anything, but I don't represent the seller. So I could be on the lookout when I go on listings. But once I listed this house, if Kim wants to buy it, I stick with the seller and she knows. So I would have to give her to Bill to write the offer,
Bill,
to write the offer on my listing.
Hey, we'll turn off the water.
Yeah. Exactly. So you have a listing and you get the sign call and you think, great, they want to buy my listing. What's that mean? I get all the money. You don't sign that buyer up with a buyer's agency agreement to buy your listing. Did you go back to your seller and say, Mr. Seller, all those promises I made on what a great job I'm going to do and how I'm going to help you price the house and negotiate? Guess what? I'm greedy. I can't do squat. I got to hand you a paper. Here's the offer. Well, Gary, can I counter? I don't know. Can I do this? I don't know. The buyer, what do I offer? I don't know. You're useless. Useless. And the minute you say, sure, you can counter, you've harmed the buyer. The minute you tell the buyer what to offer, you've harmed the seller. You can't conduct dual agency without going against your promises that you promised to get them to list the house with you. So how do you do it? There's a remedy. There's a remedy. And I guarantee you, the minute you want to get into a lawsuit, the minute that buyer feels they were harmed and the seller's higher than them, or the seller feels they were harmed and the buyer's winning, you're going to be, you screwed up. You released information to one party or the other because you're the only person involved. So you want to sell your own listings, NRA. The buyer understands that you don't represent them. You gave them a consumer notice and they are non-represented. Buyers are savvy today. They're going to call the listing agent. They don't care if they're represented. They're hoping that the listing agent is going to reduce their commission to the seller to get their offer to win. Because instead of needing 20%, maybe you'll sell it for the seller for just 15%. And you'll cut the seller's commission and their offer wins. Buyers are savvy. So on your agreement of sale that we just went over, how would you document that? You go to the very top and where it says buyer's relationship with a licensed broker, no business relationship. He doesn't have a relationship with you. And he has signed a non-representation form showing that he understands he doesn't have a relationship. Still have to give him the consumer notice. You still owe that non-represented buyer everything that's on the back page of the consumer notice. All those 10 commandments, you still owe that person because they're a consumer of real estate. They're not your customer. And you even have to go as far as saying, look, you're non-represented. So if you tell me that on this $200,000 house, you're only offering $215,000, but you'd go to $220,000, I have to tell my seller you'll go to $220,000. So I have to help you through the process, get your mortgage, get your inspections done, get through title, get you to closing. But when it comes to negotiations, if you reveal anything that could benefit my seller, I have to tell my seller. So just warn the buyer up front. Just keep everything confidential as when it comes to negotiations. But I have to help you. I can't harm you. I have to treat you fairly, honestly, in good faith. And when you go over that with them, people understand. I've sold many of my listings, got all the commission, and never did dual agency. Dual agency is meant to exist. I have a contract with Bill as my buyer's agent. That was this week. 2 weeks pass and I have a listing with Kim. She's my seller's agent. 6 weeks go by, her house hasn't sold. I'm still dragging his butt around. He wants to buy her house. I have an existing relationship with him and a existing relationship with her. In legal theory, that's true dual agency. It existed. I didn't create it. But when you get a sign call and you sign that buyer up as a buyer's agent to sell your listing, you've created dual agency. And now you've violated all your promises to your seller. You never ask your seller if you could violate those promises and not represent him anymore, right? So you created it. It was never designed to be created. And in the situation where it exists legally, because of my single agency addendum, she's aware, Bill's aware that he can't buy her house through me. I'm gonna give, what's your name? I'm sorry. Terry. I'm gonna give him to Terry. So Terry's gonna represent him on the purchase of Kim's house. I can't. If that falls apart, I get Bill back and I can show him other houses. So you understand that piece about agency. Now, if that buyer calls you on your sign call and he doesn't want to buy your house, but he really liked you, Terry, he was like, you know what, of all the agents I've met, you really know a lot about houses. You seem to know what you're doing. You're smart, you're good. Will you represent me? Absolutely, gladly. How about you come in? We'll go over what I offer as my services and we'll sign a buyer's agency agreement. So you can get buyer leads off your listing. You just can't sell your listing to a buyer off of a sign call and sign them up for that sale. They're non-represented when you're the listing agent. But if you sell them anything else, so you can use your listings, use open houses to get buyers. You just don't sign them up if they want to buy your listing. And we're doing it all the time, and we're creating undisclosed dual agency. Because I guarantee you didn't go back to your seller and tell them what you're going to do.
So if you sign a single agency addendum for a listing,
And a sale, and a buyer's agency.
well, my question is about the MLS, because it says dual agency, yes or no. I
No.
tell you, you check that.
No,
You have to check
absolutely.
on
No,
that
right.
scenario.
No, exactly. Yep. The last thing I want to go over, when you're in that buyer's agency meeting, a form that we don't use, but you could not get an offer submitted in Philadelphia area without this. They use the BFI. Some of you may have never seen it. This is a buyer's financial form that you ask your buyer to fill out. It's how you qualify your buyer to make sure that they have sufficient savings, sufficient income, where their money's coming from. Have they ever been are they in the process of getting a divorce? Do they have domestic relations? Things that would come up in financing ahead of time. So this is a great form. It's great. If you don't want them to fill it out or you think it's too much, you could pull some of the questions and ask them. It will prevent you from getting into situations where you just throw them to the mortgage company. And then the mortgage company tells you you've been shown them houses for 3 months. And oh, by the way, they're in the middle of a divorce and they're both on the mortgage and they don't have a marital separation agreement that says the wife will take over that obligation. So he's responsible for the entire mortgage on his current $750,000 house. He doesn't qualify for anything, he or she. So you could waste your time not knowing about that. Just have them fill this out. In the Philly market, you have to submit this to the listing agent to get an offer through. They're that adamant about this. So when you go to the state meetings, we hear this. Not prevalent in our marketplace. The form's the same regardless. We just don't use it. We rely more on pre-approval letters. But this is a really good form to use to really make sure you're not wasting time with a buyer who's not qualified. So I use this from the standpoint of I ask questions and just write it down. I use this kind of as a guide when I'm meeting with buyers. You can have them fill it out too, but if they're intimidated, you can still get the information by asking them, you know.
Is there any, all right, so let's say I do this, hand it to
I'm listening.
a listing agent. Is there some kind of document that says that this information is confidential with them?
Yeah, I'm sure, I would indicate that, when I send this over. But it does give the broker the information to provide this, to cooperating brokers. So when they sign it, they're authorizing, you can give it to cooperating brokers. That's all that's all on the bottom in bold. So if they don't want it, then you wouldn't submit it. So in the last few minutes, what questions do you have as far as transactions that you're stumbling with or frustrated with, or your offers aren't going through in a multiple offer situation? How many of you are winning in multiple offer situations? And you know, it's really tough with VA and FHA and rural housing, but the thing there, I think, is if you look at days on the market for some properties are sitting out there, and those may be more, the seller may be more open to FHA or VA. If your seller's a vet, they may be more compassionate towards another vet buyer too. You don't know. That's where you have dialogue with the seller, but the listing agent. Disclosures are huge. People are not reading disclosures, and they're waiving all inspections. So if you're waiving all inspections, you know, as the listing agent, you're responsible to make sure that disclosure is complete before you post it on Bright. As a buyer's agent, you're responsible to read it and make sure your buyer doesn't sign it if there's missing information. Go back to the listing agent and ask for the missing information to be cleared out. So you can still submit your offer, but you don't submit a disclosure form because it wasn't complete yet. You could always do that later. There's a lot of stuff in there if they're going to waive inspections, and use our inspection waiver form that you said you told them to get an inspection. You never recommend they don't get inspections, but you know, if they're going to get inspections, they're probably going to lose. So, you know, cash, no inspections, escalation, high deposits are going to win every time. Sometimes you just can't compete with that, so you got to try. You know, there was a house in Cedar Cliff last weekend. Did anybody see it? It was on Cedar Cliff Drive, 365,000. You know, we put in an offer, escalated, said it doesn't have to appraise. We took a low appraisal amount, as long as it appraises for this low amount, which we knew it would. We'll pay our full escalated price. So for cash, $400,000, no inspections, no contingencies. You can't compete with that. You know, sometimes you just can't compete. I would love to see our market and our state do a letter of intent so we could summarize the offer we're going to make on one page. And if your offer is accepted, then you have 24 hours to get the paperwork together to save us from going through all of that. It's used in other states. I don't know if, you know, the state would consider that. PAR would consider a form for that. You know, go to the meetings, recommend that stuff. It would save a lot of people. Like when I looked at those 19 offers and saw what people put into that, I'm thinking the hours here, the amassed hours here that are just for nothing. Like, what are you going to do?
Well, and just the time you have to take to go through them. I know that's part of what I do.
Oh, yeah, Kim and
personally,
I-
is collect all of our offers and like put them side by side. And if we have 12 offers, that takes me like 3 hours.
11 till 11:30 last night. I mean, we were 12 and a half hours. All I did was that one property.
Yeah. It's
Yeah, so,
One of the things I do with my sellers with a disclosure is to over disclose.
yes.
Because, you know, I said, first of all, you might have a better chance of not getting a home inspection. If they look at that and go, that's ridiculous, they told me that. That I think.
Well, to your point, this house I was talking about this weekend, and you can go read the disclosure, it's online. So, okay. The woman did a great job. It was the first time in a long time, because I give it to them ahead of time before my appointment, and then I go over it with them. And some people misinterpret stuff, and I bring a clean copy in case you have to redo a page. It's perfect. I get to the very last page. Have you ever filed an insurance claim? She had yes. So I'm looking for the yes answers to the insurance claim. Why is it important that insurance claims be answered? What's going to happen?
Well, the insurance, but they have to, the buyer has to get insurance and it's gonna be, it's gonna
Right.
show up.
So when the buyer goes to get insurance, the insurance company is looking to assess risk on 2 points. Is the buyer risky? So Terry files a claim every 6 months because he's always losing a guitar, a diamond ring, his wife's necklace. He files claims every 6 months, right? And then the property. So 123 Main Street has had 20 claims. So now I have a claim filer who's going to live there in a high-risk property. So instead of $1,000 a year, it's $3,000 a year. And the insurance agent assess risk by the person and the property. You and the property are listed on an insurance claims database, a national database. So they're going to type in your name and the property, and a clue report comes back. It's cumulative, something loss, utilization, something, but it spells clue. I should know that, but I don't know. It's called a clue report. So if we didn't report that, the buyer's going to find out from the insurance agent. So I look and she said, what?
It's like Carfax when you buy a car.
Exactly, same exact thing, perfect analogy, Carfax. So she says yes, and I go down and it says tree fell on shed. Okay, that makes sense. And then I thought the next word said shooting. And I said,
Oh, I
does
saw
this
that.
say shooting?
That's,
And she said, yes, I did see that.
yeah, I did
She
see that.
sheepishly
Yeah.
put her head down, and I was like, okay, trying to not make her uncomfortable. I said, well, you know, like, do you have a gun and did it accidentally discharge and blow a hole in the wall or something? No. She said, this makes me very uncomfortable. I said, I'm sorry, but we got to know what the hell the shooting was, what happened, right? So it's going to come up. So I said, just tell me the story. I'm going to take some notes and try to paraphrase what you're telling me, but we have to put an explanation here. Julie saw the house, so she would understand. So it's a ranch on the front, but it's kind of almost all out of the ground in the back, 2 steps to go down. So it's basically an exposed back ranch, windows, doors in the back. And the couple that lived there allowed a friend to stay in the basement. The friend's girlfriend's ex-boyfriend came by one night and shot up the back of the house because the friend tenant and his girlfriend were out of state, had a huge fight. She calls her ex-boyfriend. He gets pissed off at the current boyfriend, who goes over and shoots up the house. You can't make this shit up. Like, and I thought, how is this like bringing value to my life? Sit there and think, do I really make money this way?
Devaluing your life, is what it is.
It's what?
It's devaluing your.
Oh, exactly. I said, I'm gonna write a book of the crazy shit that I've dealt with in 30 years. And nobody will understand it but a realtor. But so anyway, we paraphrased it. I said, okay, so here's the facts I need. Where's the tenant now? Like, because it's empty downstairs and it was all repaired, but it was an insurance claim. So the tenant moved out of state. That's good. He's gone. And where's the shooter? Well, he's in federal prison because they had to press charges and all of that. So he's in prison. So we wrote, you know, as paraphrased as we could, that the tenant's in. And then, so I called an attorney and he said, you know, that is not a material defect about the house at all. So you really don't have to disclose it. However, you're 100% correct. It's going to come up on a clue report. So to Bill's point, be transparent. This is a long way around. Be transparent and disclose, because if it would have come up and then I explained it, then they'd say, okay, what else didn't you tell us? Because isn't every buyer suspicious that the seller knows something and they're not going to tell us, right? So I have my seller put down every little tiny thing that doesn't work. Whether it's a light switch, a crack in the tile, like, are there any blemishes in the floors? Well, if you walk around and there's 2 cracked tiles in the kitchen, put it down. So when the buyer sees there's cracked tiles, if the agent sent them the disclosure ahead of time, oh yeah, I remember reading the 2 cracked tiles. Here they are. I remember reading that the shower drips. I opened the shower curtain, it's dripping. I remember reading that. But it's when you don't disclose something, you get the phone call, and then, you know, people are going to forget things too. But you don't want that suspicion of what else aren't they telling you on the disclosure.
That's how I explain it to sellers when they're
Right.
filling that out.
Because you will, that's the lawsuit and misrepresentation and non-disclosure. And you know what, 19 offers, because she said to me, is this going to affect the sale of my house? I don't have a clue. I don't know. Like, I would buy your house. It won't bother me, but I don't know how they're going to react to that. Well, obviously nobody reacted to it, or they didn't read it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I had a buyer with a house that he was buying, we were looking at, and you can see clearly there was a bullet hole in the house. And it turns out the husband died by suicide by cop. The cops were at the house. It was apparently quite a nasty scene. My buyer didn't care, but you know, it's one of those.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, what if you have a listing agent that doesn't put a disclosure up because it's in the state?
That's tough, because and I say this all the time, unless that person has never seen the property, like their mother lived there for 20 years, they lived in California for 25, never saw their mother for 25 years, don't even know if it's red, yellow, black, or white, they can sign it blank. But if they're paying the bills, they know there's public water, they know there's public sewer. If they're filling the oil tank, they know there's oil heat. An attorney will argue, and I fought with many attorneys, it says they don't have to, but they do have to disclose what they know. So I asked the listing agent, But there again, if you're competing and it's an estate and the listing agent doesn't do it and you say, I want one, well, where's your buyer's offer gonna go? I mean, it's tough. So you have to really understand your buyer and say, we should ask for one. It's the right thing to do, but by asking for it, we can jeopardize your chance of getting the offer through, because I guarantee you, there's a buyer out there who doesn't care, or a buyer's agent who doesn't realize they should ask for this. So what do you want me to do? And here's your pros and cons of doing it. So you gotta let your buyer. In the old days, when we didn't have this craziness, I would have insisted they give me the basics answered anyway. But today, if you do that, you could let your buyer decide, let your buyer decide. What are you finding? I mean, with the states, most of them have no.
Well, I made my estate.
Thanks,
people-
Gary.
Sure, Terry, call with any questions.
State people fill it out.